Hello and welcome back to another week of Motivation and Truth. This week I want to speak about the topic of being Christian. And this, I hope, is going to encourage you. As a reminder, I want to let you know that what we do with Motivation and Truth is to come back to biblical truths, to come back to Scripture, to come back to living by the Word, which is Jesus Christ, the living Word. So the encouragement today on speaking about being Christian is to help us think. It's to help us think about what does it mean to be a Christian. So many times what happens in life is that we start to live by the assumptions that we ourselves do, and that becomes habits. So we start to assume that we are Christian, and because of that claim in our own minds, the habit is that I do good, I go to church, I read Bible, I pray. However, that's not what Christianity really is about. I want to quickly read you a statement that Robert West made. And this is a phenomenal statement. It says, if we search our hearts and discover that our primary interest in God's will is self-centered, it may be that all we really want is God's blessing on our will. Isn't that a strong statement? I want you to read this with me again. If we search our hearts and discover that our primary interest in God's will is self-centered, it may be that all we really want is God's blessing on our will. If we think about that, Christianity really is about living in God's will and then doing God's will. So it's not a set of laws and it's not a set of rules. It's in a loving relationship. And what Christianity comes down to is that we accept what Christ has done so that His own Spirit can live in us. And that relationship then, because it is restored to the original intent, we can live as Christ did. So most Christians today, when they live their lives, they assume certain things on Christianity and they start to live these habits and by these habits. But at the end, Christianity is all about will. Whose will are you living? Is it your own or is it God's will? And that's what I want to encourage us to think about. There is a question that I want to pose, and the question is, what is the chief end of man? And the chief end of man is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. To glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. Now, I want to read you two scriptures specifically on will. And this is to help us think about the context of will. Ephesians 5 verse 17 says, therefore, do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. I love the scripture in Ephesians 5. Do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. When last have you thought about a statement like that? Are you trying diligently every day to understand what the will of the Lord is? Can I make you a statement from Scripture as to not just what the will of the Lord is? This isn't helping us gain an understanding of what the will of the Lord is. This is speaking about the will of God. Okay, not just what He wants. This is the will of God. Revelations 4 verse 11 says this, you are worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they exist and were created. Do you see that it is by the will of God that all things exist, that all things were created? It was by the will of God that all things exist. Now, I want to read you a statement, then a scripture, then another statement before we conclude this message. When your will is God's will, you will have your will. This is a Charles Spurgeon statement that I love. When your will is God's will, you will have your will. And so therefore my question is your will God's will? Because that is what Christianity is about. It is a surrendered will. No longer what I want. No longer my will, Lord, but your will. So the next scripture I want to read before we conclude with another statement is Philippians 3, verse 7 to 11. I want to know Christ. Yes, to know the power of his resurrection and participation in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, and so somehow attaining to the resurrection from the dead. That is what we as Christians should look into. So this week I want to ask you, diligently ask yourself whether your will is God's will. Diligently ask yourself. I want to motivate you in this truth that Christianity is all about God's will, because everything exists and is sustained by his will. And so therefore the last statement before we end off is a statement that Francis Chan made. We never grow closer to God when we just live life. It takes deliberate pursuit and attentiveness. It takes deliberate pursuit and attentiveness. And so therefore the encouragement for this week is, being Christian, what does it mean? It's not just doing the will of God, because that might be lawish. It's to be surrendered and submitted to the will of God, because we understand the will of God. We understand that everything exists by the will of God. And therefore Christianity becomes the only way of true life, because everything outside of Jesus Christ is dead. Let's think about this week. Make the effort into these scriptures and these statements and ask yourself that question. May you be totally blessed. Bye-bye.